Hey y'all, welcome to As the Brazos Falls. We are a new small town Texas storytelling podcast. We love true crime, ghost stories, murder mysteries, and random tales from local individuals. I'm here with my co-hosts Pat and Nick. We're going to start with a tale from the beginning of the settlers in this area. And Nick is actually born and raised right here in Falls County.
Absolutely.
And he doesn't know the tale, but I can let him kind of tell you a little bit about his backstory.
Yeah, I don't know jack shit about what you're ready to talk about right now. My family moved here in 1983, a year before I was born, and they came from up north. They came down from Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And so when they first got here, they didn't hear anything about today's topic. In fact, a lot of people don't know when they first get to Marlin about what we're about to talk about until years and years, or in my case, 20 years, 25 years later after they get here, right? So a lot of hidden secrets, a lot of stories not told. And that brings to question why.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting, the historic tales from around this area. Half of the people or less know about them. The other half, they don't want to know, or I don't know what it is about this area. But there's lots of hidden gems here, and today we're going to dive into the Morgan family massacre. And it's just as horrific as its name, but Pat is more of the historic fact lady of our podcast, and so we'll kind of be bouncing the story back and forth. And Pat, do you want to just tell us about the families first, and then we'll dive into the story a little bit? So John and James Marlin, right?
John and James Marlin, the brothers from Ireland. Not a direct route from Ireland to Texas, but arrived in the late 1820s, early 1830s. Like you'd mentioned, a real point of contention, very contentious area at that time.
So you mean like basically during that time we have Mexican settlers, Indians, and then we have new settlers coming from other countries to the area.
Yes, and the Republic of Texas. The Great Getaway Scrape in 1835, I think, followed by the founding of the Republic in Texas in 1836. So a lot of people in the area. Groups were moving in and moving back out in reaction to the upheaval and the uncertainties at the time.
So the Native American community was prevalent here and kind of spread across the South. Now, the Marlin and the Morgan family, James and George and their wives and children, they settled, which is known as Marlin now, but it was Bucksnort.
Bucksnort.
Yeah.
What a great name.
Yeah, there was actually a local bar in Marlin called the Bucksnort that my friend Kaylee owned for a while, but unfortunately it didn't last.
Keeping
but I always wondered
alive.
about that name. Yeah.
I love that.
It's kind of cool that she had a bar named that. But so the Morgan and Marlin family, they were close-knit. They lived about, 7 to 10 miles away from one another?
Yes, and it appears that some of them actually lived closer. There seems to have been some intermarriage between the groups as well. So definitely more than just friends and neighbors.
And back then, numbers mattered, right? So, the bigger the family, the more protection you had and things like that. Now, unfortunately, now, I know you said there's different stories about their housing. One was they had a huge house together, sort of, that was split. The story, for today's story, we're going to focus on, the Marlin family had a house and the Morgan family had a house. And the Marlin family, I read that it was about 7 miles away from the Morgan family's house, but that's...
There were definitely two separate homes. Homesteads, I guess you would say, about 7 miles apart. John Morgan's son-in-law was James Marlin, so like we said, there's a lot of intermarriage there. So I don't know if we could strictly call it the Morgan place and the Marlin place, but some combination of the two.
So basically, these families, they farmed together, they took care of their families together, they built together, they were the community.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So basically, the Marlin men most of the men, except like maybe the younger guys. Same thing with the Morgan family. They, on January 1st, they decided to go out, and I heard they were getting corn or dealing with corn or something like that, farming.
Corn seems to be a consistent argument that that's what they were doing. They were going to town for corn. Other accounts say that they had gone hunting. Whatever the case may be, the majority of the able-bodied men were gone as of New Year's Day, 1839.
So all the women, basically, and children and the elderly stayed at the Morgan home.
Exactly.
Okay, so the story that I heard about was I've talked to a few people in the community as well, and this is like the consensus of that and me reading several different articles online. But basically, to my knowledge, it is the women and children and elderly were at the Morgan home, and they were chilling by a fire, hanging out, doing some yarn work, and then they heard the calls of Indians in the distance. And at that point, I heard that they were getting rustled up and getting nervous, trying to figure out what they were going to do. One of the kids just kind of like took off, and then in come the Indians. I heard that the Indians scalped immediately Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, which is the grandparents basically of the family, and then several of the women and men, like right away. As soon as they entered the home, scalped them, killed them. Then Isaac, like I said, he was a younger boy on the Isaac Marlin. He went and hid around a fence and stayed there until the Indians left, basically. At that point, there was Stacy Ann, who the Indians thought they killed. They did not scalp her, though.
They did not. Lucky for Sarah Morgan.
Sarah or
Oh, no,
Stacey?
I'm so sorry. Stacy.
Okay,
yes,
Stacy
my
Ann Morgan.
apologies.
And I heard they did chop her up pretty good. Her face, her hands, her body. So they basically left her for dead. During this, the Indians did bust up the floor. Like in the house, they were looking for goods because they were there to murder and to steal whatever they could, and then they were out, basically. So they busted up the floors. I did hear that Stacy Ann, now of course this is hearsay, rolled to one of those holes in the floor and stayed there. So like when Isaac thought it was clear, he came back to the house and he was like looking around, seeing all these dead people, and Stacy thought that Isaac were the Indians still there that came back. So she was like, I need to play dead. If I don't play dead, I'm going to be killed. I mean, she was basically bleeding to death anyways. But, so he took her for being dead as well. But like I said, she was in the floor. So it wasn't like he was getting to her. But he did stay there until around like 10-ish. And who knows if that's like legit or not. I might have been 9:31. No. But he covered up the bodies with sheets or whatever he could find, and then he waited around a little while and decided to take off to his homestead, which was about 7 miles away.
7 miles.
So this kid's like 10 years old or something, and then like run 7 miles to go find help, basically. Well, Stacy Ann, there's all this time passing, and she's in bad shape, but she wants out of the house. So she gets out of the house somehow. She ends up in the woods, hiding in the woods. And at night, there's a lot of coyotes around here, so she would hear coyotes calling. Some of them were super close to her, where she really could have reached out and touched a coyote. But for some reason, they didn't attack her, even though she thought for sure she was going to be dead from the Indians coming back. Because a lot of times back then, they would come into a house, kill, rob it, leave, but then they would come back and burn the house down. So that's why she wanted out of the house. She's like, okay, they're coming back. I need to get out of here during this time. Well, somehow she survives through the night, wakes up the next morning, and is just like so thirsty. She wakes up because she hears cowbells. They have milk cows. And she's like, oh my God, the cows are going to water. Like, I need water, you know? So she gets over to a cow, and the cow's walking to water. She's basically holding onto this cow's tail and bell and the cow's like dragging her to the river to get some water to drink. She drinks water. That gives her like a new burst of like energy, like, oh my God, I might survive this. At that time, she looks up and the men are riding back to the house. This is a story.
The rescue.
Yeah, they're like, wow, the
rescue
cavalry's
party.
coming in. But the guys, they show up at the inn and they're like, what? They find her. She's the only survivor besides Isaac, who already left. The men knew nothing of the story as they show up. They're just coming back. And she happens to be there all bloody and everything. So at that point, there's nothing that happens. Like, there's no retaliation because nothing's going on kind of thing. They just deal with their dead. And then, I don't know what the date is about this part.
Let's talk about the contention of whether they were buried in one mass grave.
So would that be on their property, or?
I would assume so. I mean, it's 1839. You have shovels.
So they just threw
You have
everybody in
horses
one
and
grave.
carts, so it would make sense that
wow.
you dig one large grave. And
A lot of cemeteries back in those days, especially family cemeteries, were, if not on the property, very close to the property. So I could see that.
it would make sense.
That's kind of weird, because it's like,
It's a little creepy, yeah.
Yeah, and where was it? Was it on the river? Was it far away from the river? Because this is another thing that I heard, that part of the reason why the massacre happened was because the Morgan family built their log cabin on an Indian burial grave. So basically they're like, this is ours. You all just built your house here. We're going to ixnay you guys. And so that's why it happened. And it was right on the river. Yeah, it was right on the river. So I could see why that would ruffle their feathers. And I don't mean that in like feathers Indians kind of thing, but
Does anybody see a downside to putting a burial ground on the floodplain on the banks of the Brazos River?
Totally.
Just maybe that didn't occur to people in
Well, and the
the
body,
18.
yeah, it probably didn't. Just like in the 1900 storm in Galveston, they dumped all the bodies in the water and they were washed back on the
up.
shore. Yeah, so it's like, yeah, they didn't think about that. Or maybe they just didn't know the currents and whatnot, because people are from all over, basically.
Right.
Now, the cool thing, or not cool, but, I mean, I guess it is like the Marlin family, the Indians showed up at their house. And on their homestead, not the Morgan, so the separate one, the Marlin family, they fought the Indians off. They killed a lot of Indians.
Successfully, apparently,
Yeah,
although
successfully.
they did take some casualties.
Yes, but they killed a lot more, and that brought up the treaty. Eventually, after more death and all that, they finally signed a treaty so that there would be peace throughout this area, basically. Correct?
Yes, exactly. The Treaty of 1845.
Okay, so when was the massacre? And
1839.
yeah, so that's a long time. 6 years of murder and stealing. I'm sure there was rape and other things.
Frontier justice.
Yeah, one thing I didn't mention that I wanted to is that the Morgan family had a slave, a young girl, and the Indians took her, and no body, like physical body, ever showed up. Nothing was ever heard from her again, but they just took the black girl and left, and she was like a teen from what I heard. Did you find any of that in your research?
I did not, however, I did in a lot of Falls County research. There was a huge slave population here.
Oh, well, that came after. So after the treaty, a bunch of slaves came. I forgot who brought them over, but that's what kind of brought up the mass farming here for the black lands. And we have really good dirt in this area, so tomatoes, corn, cotton, like all the things. And that kind of made this area like flourish, basically.
Yeah, well,
Exactly.
I mean, there was a time when Marlin had one cotton mill for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a second. And you can go into residential areas in Marlin and find plantation homes still standing with historical markers just sitting right out in front of them. So
I want to
yeah.
do that. Go check them all out. I think that would be kind of cool, Because I love going down to the falls, Brazos on the Falls, which is a park here, and just like kind of chilling on the banks because it looks so crazy, and you can imagine like the history, and I could totally see it's like being in Bandera where you could feel the energy of like, people before us. But
So speaking of historical markers, there are two historical markers relevant to this incident. The first is a marker dedicated to Stacey Ann Morgan, and the second is an Indian battlefield marker. Was put up in 1936 by the state, and it is near the pioneer home of George Morgan, where a battle took place January 16th, 1839, between settlers in the regions and the Indians under Chief Jose Maria, in which the colonists were defeated.
So can you tell me a little bit about what happened to the Morgan estate once everybody was dead, basically, except for Stacy? Because women didn't even own property back then. It wasn't like a thing. And Isaac, the other survivor, he was part of the other family.
So I find this really interesting and somewhat inspiring. I don't know if it is frontier laxity in law, or just speaking specifically to Stacey Ann Marlin Morgan. So she, again, the intermarriage there. She initially was granted a huge land grant from the Republic of Texas in compensation for supplies that she had lent to the army. It took
like feeding them when they're coming
feeding
through.
them cattle, corn, large quantities. There's a receipt I found that is actually very interesting to go through. Took her years to get clear title and deed to those lands. But once she did, she sold off chunks of it at a time. It seems to have been the thing that supported the family going on through almost the 1900s.
I mean, she outlived her. She ended up getting
She
married, having
outlived
children.
everyone.
She outlived everyone. Outlived her husband. I mean,
She
she
didn't die
died
until 1894. And her giant land grant encompasses parts of Fall and Bell County.
Oh well, I didn't know
So
that
it was pretty huge.
I wonder how many acres that is, and people that don't know this area, what would be your guess?
I found one estimate that it was upwards of 76,000 acres.
Wow, that's a lot.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a lot. So any questions you have about the Morgan family massacre, Nick?
I have one question, and that is, do we know the tribe that was indigenous to this area and that performed this massacre, this war?
So Jose would have been the leader, right? Is that what you said?
I find that very interesting. Yes, his name was Jose. Was it Martinez? That's not correct. It definitely had affected a Hispanic heritage for some reason. Jose Maria, Chief Jose Maria. Most accounts blame the Catos. And that seems to be pretty consistent, although there was a lot of inter-Indian tribe fighting during this era between the Wacoans, the Caddos, and the Cherokees. The Cherokees essentially won and pushed the Catos and the Wacoans out, but nonetheless, come 1839, they were still raiding in the Marlin.
Well, when the treaty came, did it kind of stop when they signed the treaty? Did it really stop things?
It really did, and apparently part of that was due to the support of Jose Maria.
Okay, he wanted peace as well.
He as well at that point had agreed that the peace was best.
Yeah, and this area is just so old. I mean, like, settlers from the beginning, even though they're small families, like Marlin is the county seat for Falls County, and there's lots of history that we'll dive into throughout our tales about the craziness of Falls County.
Well, yeah, because it doesn't sound like too long after this treaty and after the death of Sarah was her name? Was the last surviving member? It doesn't sound like too long after all of this when the Allens came around and put, it made their imprint on
Is that
Marlin.
the Allen, like the Allen House?
Like the Allen House, yes, absolutely.
Place.
Dr. Allen and his family. I'm sure from this point we'll go into just going by the years. It's not too much before the bridge collapse that killed a bunch of people. the original Brazos Bridge collapse. So it sounds like we're on the precipice of a lot of historical things that happened in this area,
especially throughout the 1900s, because the Hilton Hotel, like all those kinds of things happen.
Absolutely, and I don't want to get too far into some of that history now. A lot of especially when we get into the Hilton goes hand in hand with the history of the Palace Theater, which I have a huge attachment to, and we'll get into all that later on down the line. But going back to, we mentioned earlier at the very beginning how this area was Indian, but it was also Mexican. Like there was a lot of intermingling, it seemed, and just going by the name of the chief of this tribe, it sounds like we had some intermingling at some point between those two before the Morgans and the Marlins even came this way. Do we know anything about the history of what this land, of what this area was before any of that? Like, is there even anything out there?
So there was a lot of interaction. Apparently the Brazos Valley area that we're referring to in the bigger scope was not necessarily a home spot for any one tribe, but was used very communally for hunting, harvesting, water, exactly. And then also a lot of infighting between them. In addition to the fact that this had been Mexican territory for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it would be... it sounds like the resources of the area would play a huge part in all of this. The fighting between them in the beginning, and then the later on with the Morgans and the Marlins. Just off the top of my head, putting together what you said earlier about the corn. If corn was rich in this area, we already know mineral water is a huge part of this area, and water in general. So it sounds like...
tell us about that, though, because some people probably might not know about the mineral water here.
Yeah, and that's definitely more that we can get into in future episodes. In fact, the mineral wells and the bathhouses will play into the history of Marlin huge later on down the line. But this is a hot spot in Texas, and in, I think, one of the hot spots in the entire country for mineral water. And of course, about 3 hours down the road, we have Mineral Wells, Texas, which is the number one hot spot, or at least the proclaimed number one hot spot. But there was a time in history where people came to Marlin for mineral water healing, and it plays a huge role. So I have to wonder if all of this didn't begin in the very beginning simply because of the resources in the area.
And I wonder if that's why they made the treaty. Because they're like, we need this. We both need to be able to hunt, to be able to get water, gather, farm. You're trying to survive. We're trying to survive. Like, y'all aren't leaving. We're not leaving. So let's make peace because of resources.
From the indigenous tribe perspective, attacking the Marlin Morgan families was not wise. It seemed to have been the killing of the women and children that spurred the very early Texas legislature to authorize men to patrol the region, which...
On their
own, which then led to the eventual peace treaty and sort of squashed those
Did Texas have any part of that? Like the Republic about the treaty? Was it just like...
Yes, it was an official treaty declared in 1845 between the indigenous nations,
and
however
Texas.
they proclaim themselves, and the nation of Texas at that time.
And did the Texas Rangers or any law enforcement, was there even law enforcement? When did the Texas Rangers even come into fruition?
I don't know, Nick, but that's an excellent question.
We do need an episode on the Texas Rangers because we're so close to it. That whenever we talk about Bonnie and Clyde and all that, we'll bring that in, I think, because that's a whole nother thing. I mean, there's even that museum in Waco, so that's pretty well known around
and
here.
I just want to throw this out, that Falls County wasn't even officially formed until 1850. So these really are the very, very birthdays of the settlements of around Falls County.
I mean, you can't blame them in a way because that's how things were handled back then, but if somebody came and was like desecrating your family's plot, of course something's going to happen. I mean, and maybe they didn't know, or maybe they did and they just didn't care. I mean, I'm sure that played a part in it, you know? But it's weird, though. Like, a lot of people just, like how we talked about in the beginning, don't know this story or the start of this area or anything like that. And, I mean, even in the research, I was surprised to find out that there's no video recordings of people telling the story or anything like that. There's very few articles. It's just not out there. And to me, it's just interesting how it all started.
Everything about this area is sort of hush-hush, isn't it?
And I think if there was more of that, obviously back then we wouldn't have had video recording of the initial accounts, but where are the handwritten accounts? I mean, everything was documented by somebody somehow back in that day.
Stacey wrote a first-hand account. Keep in mind that she was 10 when the incident occurred, and she wrote her first-hand account much later in life.
It was way later in life.
Way later in life. And there is some argument that it is not the most accurate telling of events. Although
what about Isaac?
It's first person. Isaac did not seem to, at least to my knowledge that I was able to find, to write any accounts or give interviews that were later reproduced. Stacey Ann seemed to be the one that liked to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to do some quick research, if y'all are okay with that, on the formation of the Texas Rangers, just out of pure curiosity, if they could have played a part in the treaty and in solving any of this. And it does appear that the Texas Rangers Division was first originally founded in October 17th of 1835.
Oh!
Okay. I wonder if that was part of the reasoning for it. Because of all these issues and whatnot going around here, you know, it's like, okay, we need to establish some kind of order or something.
And also in the heat of the Revolutionary War, the Texas Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Well, if y'all are okay with it, I propose we take a quick break and we get back with the audience as soon as possible. What do y'all say?
Sounds good.